Nile is the longest river in the world. Many races and cultures have lived along the Nile. These people have depended on the river for food, water, and a waterway for traveling. And their way of life hasn't changed much in thousands of years. The Nile River flows through Africa from south to north for over 4,000 miles. There are two main sources of the Nile, the White Nile and the Blue Nile. The White Nile begins in the waters of Lake Victoria. The highlands of Ethiopia are the source of the Blue Nile. And on its journey, the water rushes through forested hills, wanders through grassy swamps, and flows on through the dry desert out to the Mediterranean Sea. Here in Ethiopia, 80% of the Nile's water comes from these highlands. Around Lake Tana, the land has many trees and the soil is rich. People live in villages and towns, just as they have for centuries. In this town, Gondor, there is a castle that was built almost 1,000 years ago. At Lake Tana, Ethiopian men travel in papyrus boats to cut the papyrus growing on the shore. They make loud noises to scare away the hippopotamuses, crocodiles, and snakes. Then they cut and gather the papyrus. Papyrus is a marsh reed that grows up to 15 feet high. In its stem are air pockets that make it float, so it is a good material for building boats. Papyrus has another use. Ever since ancient times, people have beaten papyrus into flat strips and pressed them together to make paper. On this paper, ancient Egyptians drew hieroglyphics, or pictures that became the first written language. They used animals as symbols or words. Christianity has been practiced by Ethiopian people for centuries. Today, just as in ancient times, the people celebrate an annual religious festival. By the river's edge, some families gather together and eat bread and drink coffee. People in this area depend on trees for their fuel, and many of the trees that protect the mountain slopes are being cut down. To the west of Ethiopia, the White Nile flows from Lake Victoria through Uganda and on into Sudan. In southern Sudan, the Nile River floods the flatlands and forms the Sud, the largest swamp in the world. The Sud is home to the Nuer, a people whose lives are devoted to cattle, and the Nuer and their cattle depend on the Nile to survive. Here it is hot and dry. There are few trees, so the people use cow dung for fuel. Anak lights a fire. She puts ash on the cows to keep the insects away. Women milk the cows, grind corn for meal, and take care of the household. Like children everywhere, newer boys play with what they have and what they know. These newer boys are molding small clay cows. When newer boys grow up, the number of cows each boy owns will determine his status in the tribe. During the day, the men and boys herd the cattle into the grasslands. At the heat of the day, they bring their cattle to the Nile River to drink and to bathe. The newer people have no permanent home. They are nomadic. Every spring, when the monsoon rains come to Central Africa, the newer take their cattle to graze on higher land. With the rains, the water flows from the mountains, taking with it rich, dark soil. And then it rushes down the river. The flood affects all of the countries along the Nile, from Uganda and Ethiopia through Sudan to Egypt. In the Sud, when the flood is over, the newer people return with their cattle to the river's edge. Women repair the ground around their clay huts. Near the doorway, the newer decorate their homes with a wavy pattern, a symbol for the Nile. A mud-shaped cone with a design that is unique to each family is placed on the top of each home. The muddy silt waters of the Blue Nile join the nutrient-rich waters of the White Nile. The Nile River brings these nutrients to form the rich, fertile soil of Egypt's fields. Today, most Egyptians live in towns and cities like Cairo. Others who are farmers live and grow crops on the rich soil along the Nile's river banks. At a farm in Tanta, Egypt, located in the Nile Delta, Adel and his family own 50 acres of land. Adel is an Egyptian farmer, and Mohammed is his farm manager. The soil in the delta is so fertile that anyone who owns just a few acres of land can make a decent living. Adel checks his crops.
This black earth is actually what made this Egypt and what made this farm most prosperous. This black earth is the magic of Egypt. They say Egypt is the gift of the Nile. Look at the sediments here, full of iron, zinc, manganese, everything that any plant can need. It's a miracle. The Nile every year brings us a miracle.
Next door to Adel's farm, local villagers grow enough rice for their own needs. Just as in ancient times, the people in the community worked together to farm grain. This is a threshing machine. It separates the grain from the stalks. For the Egyptians, it has always been a problem to raise the water from the river up to the fields. So ancient Egyptians devised ways to irrigate or supply water to their crops. The shadoof is the most common way to water the fields. It is like a seesaw. A bucket is tied to one end of the rope and a weight to the other. Water is lifted and tipped into ditches that run across fields. The sakya, or the water wheel, is another way to lift the water from the Nile to the fields. The wheel is powered by an ox. Buckets in the wheel are filled in the river and then spill out to a ditch that leads to the fields. In modern times, a water wheel can also be powered by a diesel pump. The shadoof and the sakya made it possible to irrigate the land all year round. Ancient Egyptians produced so much grain they had to build granaries to store the surplus. They grew grains like barley, wheat, and other cereals that they used to make bread. Women still bake in clay ovens. The bread has no yeast in it, so the loaves look like thick, crusty pancakes. In the city of Aswan, ancient Egyptians first measured the annual rise of the river using a device called an allometer. In a good year, the flood would rise 27 feet above its winter level. 3 feet higher, and the water would destroy the villages. 3 feet lower, and not enough food could be grown. Before the Aswan Dam was built, this gauge was used to measure the Nile. Alongside it is a much older measure that was used in ancient times. The amount each farmer paid in taxes was calculated according to the flood of the Nile. The pharaohs collected the taxes and may have used the tax money to build pyramids or tombs for ancient Egyptian kings and queens. Date palm trees grow along the Nile's shores. Dates can be made into sugar, wine, and can also be used as a medicine. Since ancient times, date, fig, dune palms, and many other fruit trees have lined the Nile River bank. Some are native to Egypt. Many others were brought from distant lands. The Nile has always provided other foods for the people, such as birds, like geese, and fish. The rich, muddy clay from the Nile is not only important for growing crops and fruit trees, but it can be used to make bricks for people to build houses. Bricks are still made the way they were made in ancient times. To make bricks, mud is scooped up from the river and then poured into wooden molds. The bricks dry in the sun for several days before they are ready for building. The clay of the Nile is also used for making pottery. These men are stamping the water out of the mud for the potter. This activity is one of the oldest crafts in Egypt. For thousands of years, mud has been shaped into pots to store and transport grain. Potters also make large, flat-bottomed water jars called bellas. Hanan and her family live in the Manchiat Kasab village along the Nile. Hanan is getting married. Her mother has struggled to feed her 13 children, but she visits Hanan's new home, and she knows that Hanan will be well taken care of by her new husband. Hanan is 16, and today is her wedding day. Her family and friends celebrate her marriage. The water of the Nile provides for people today, as it has for centuries past. The Nile continues to be the source of life for the people, for those who farm the land, and for those who live along its riverbanks.